At the University of Regina, the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Digital Resource Hub showcases impactful EDI initiatives across the campus.
It's a centralized, accessible resource for our community and post-secondary institutions nationally.
Join us to hear the stories behind the initiatives shaping our campus.
So our department is a unique department in some ways. We're a bridge of two programs, so Women and Gender Studies and Religious Studies, but within that, EDI-related issues are woven throughout both programs. So some of the key areas around accessibility, not just with respect to, again, trying to encourage and make the space more inclusive for students coming in, but also in terms of like curriculum and the content that we have in our classes and our approach to teaching. Decolonization is, again, a central theme in many of our courses, as well as in our department approach and practices. 2S LGBTQIA+ issues and rights, similarly, both in terms of approach, practices, and more broadly, both of our programs have very deep and long-standing collaborations and connections with different community organizations and individuals. So again, most of that is informed through an EDI, what we would now call more recent EDI lens. So for Women and Gender Studies, pretty central to the discipline is this notion of intersectionality. So the understanding that there are different forms of oppression that function to reinforce and inform each other, and how they show up in our everyday behaviors and in many ways taken for granted practices and kind of habits that we have. So that's deeply, again, interconnected with equity, diversity, and inclusion. And religious studies in many ways is about understanding what are our cultural practices and beliefs and how they inform our society as well as our own individual behaviors, how we make meaning and how we come together. So again, as we can imagine, intimately tied to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we don't have specific like workshops or there was this training, I guess I would say. But again, all of our classes have EDI content woven throughout. So again, in the curriculum, but also in the approach to teaching and the types of courses that we have on offer. One of the main examples that is newly launched is a certificate in trans, queer, and gender studies. So that's available for students. And what was really exciting about that initiative is we actually looked around campus and saw that there were a lot of classes that are on, queer theory and trans studies, that are on kind of queer performance, or gay literature, the history of queer and trans rights. And so we actually said, okay, let's bring all of those together. So almost building a community across campus, and then students who are already kind of interested in those areas now get to have a certificate and a recognition of work in that area. So that's a recent and pretty exciting development. But other things that we do that have, again, been kind of long-standing is my colleagues in religious studies have come together to create a textbook, and Kevin Bond is the editor of the textbook, and that's free for students. So all students taking Religious Studies 100 need that. So it's a form of accessibility. But again, other ways that we incorporate is, again, through the assignments that we create, the content that we have, and again, our kind of approach to students. So trying to meet students where they're at and find out what kind of supports that they need. So I think that's probably the core. And I think all of us are pretty open and upfront about if students need particular resources, if they want to find out more about certain things, that we are sharing resources, again, for international students on what might be available for students with accessibility needs, what, again, resources might be, and what other campus and community-wide groups are available for them, and doing our own kind of, education around those things. I know a lot of my colleagues do this as well as I try to do it, is bring in people from different campus groups and centers to talk to the class so students know, or bring them to them. So one of the things I used to do, it's now online, so it's a little harder to encourage students to do this, but is to have a reading that was on reserve at the First Nations University Library. So students actually in first year would go and actually see that campus and experience the library and kind of, learn a bit more about their campus. So bringing them to Tatawa Center or other places on campus, knowing about UR Pride. We also, as a department, have a long history relationship with the Women's Center. So those types of ways, I'm now sharing probably too much, but we've tried to kind of have that pretty woven and interconnected while not having specific training and workshops. It's kind of through and through with what we do. So we don't have a specific EDI committee. As I kind of mentioned, it's kind of woven through our practice and our, policies as a unit. But many of our faculty members, in fact, probably all of them, have done some form of service or community work that is deeply tied to EDI. So Brenda Anderson, who's a colleague of ours, who actually bridges our department in religious studies and women's studies, is a community engaged researcher and is currently serving as Elder Lorna's helper, and it's in her third year as Luther's Elder in Residence program. That's just one example of Brenda's work. Kevin Bond, who is our former department head, and again, the department as a whole provides this kind of support, but Kevin has kind of spearheaded it for support for the Campus for All program, again in kind of financial support as a department, but also in supporting students in his classes. William Arnell, who's in religious studies, has also served as the grievance chair for a number of years on IRFA. Michelle Stewart's research, she's currently serving as the associate dean, and equity is woven into her position there. But also her research involves writing GLADU reports, has a direct community engagement. Randall Rogers, who's one of my colleagues, also spearheaded the certificate I had just mentioned in trans, queer, and gender studies, and also was a key faculty member coordinating IRQUI, which is the University of Regina Queer Initiative. And I've served on the Equity Committee and as Equity Chair, and very privileged to serve with Suhatha on the kind of Equity Advisory task group as well. So all of us kind of have pretty engaged and longstanding roles. We have initiated a decolonization committee as a unit. It's still pretty new. We kind of started having those conversations in 2023, and illnesses and also people being on sabbatical has interrupted it, but that work is ongoing. And really it's kind of both to examine things in everyday practices that we do, so how we hold meetings and how we kind of structure our department in ways that maybe we can make some change, as well as more long-standing goals, so how we're thinking about hiring and different other kind of policies and our curriculum. So that's kind of new, and that feels kind of exciting to be starting that work. I think one of the most positive outcomes we've seen is that we continue and maintain long-standing community connections. So for myself, which is happening on Wednesday, I have a long-standing relationship with Queer City Cinema, and so every year that festival takes place in September, and I have a partnership with the festival that one of their performance artists comes and does a workshop, not only for students in my class, but we open it up to the public. And so to get that invitation every year speaks to, again, a really kind of successful collaboration. As I mentioned, kind of Brenda Anderson's work at Luther, supporting the Elder in Residence, that's grown out of long-standing and engaged activism and work on her own behalf in terms of decolonization. So I think that, yeah, we all have, again, these long-standing relationships with the community that to me feels like a real success with those continued partnerships. The other, I would say, positive outcome is that the building of relationships, and we've had some transition, so we've had faculty retire and we have new faculty coming in, but the building of relationships and the commitment to kind of rethink, okay, what are our programs, what are we offering, and how do they speak to broader inclusion and equity issues, and that's what led to kind of the emergence of the Decolonization Committee and the prioritization of a position. We've been seeking to have a new hire, and the priority area is around decolonization and Indigenous feminism and spirituality. So again, that's part of that work that we've been doing. So the certificate is very new, but obviously I'm very biased. I think it's a great resource. A lot of people can take, I guess, sort of HR-related equity certificates, and what I like about this is it would complement that, but also provide that kind of deeper historical and theoretical foundation. So why certain things have emerged, so why certain identities and movements have come, and how they're connected to others and how they build and support each other, which feels really exciting. So as opposed to just kind of like, you know, these are kind of the basics that you need to know. It's like, well, how has this come to be, and what are the kind of underlying tensions? So I think that certificate is really exciting, and we are living in a very particular moment where a lot of people are seeking to understand, and we need to create spaces for dialogue around gender and sexual diversity, around colonialism and the ongoing impacts, around racism. And so I think having spaces where students can come together and again bridge interdisciplinary courses, that feels really exciting, and actually speaking to what we need to be doing is coming together collaboratively and having a greater understanding for what people are feeling afraid of, where some of these social justice and equity attacks are coming from, and how to move forward and kind of bridge and address in a systemic way. Probably one of the most obvious challenges that we face is we are a very small unit. Like I think we have sort of 6.5, because again, the colleges are connected but kind of independent. And so of course that has impact on what we're able to do as a unit. And many of us, as I've sort of been sharing, take on additional admin and service roles. And so again, that's all very meaningful work, but it does of course impact what we're able to do as a department, as a unit that way. So it feels really exciting about getting to share with both of you and with more broadly as part of the EDI Hub, is that I think all of us are doing these little pieces and these initiatives, and many of us feel like we're doing them in isolation or aren't aware of where that's happening in other places. And so really building up the campus-wide connections and having more profile for the work feels really important and can speak to some of the challenges that I think a lot of us face around capacity. And I think another thing is we don't know about a lot of initiatives that are being done, and many of us would probably lend support to them, but we don't know what's happening. So again, having this collective space where we can kind of find out and learn what's being done, and that feels hopeful. And again, building up all of the small pieces of work that is being done, that does add up. So that's sort of my positive take, is I think a lot of us are feeling the pinch of capacity. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think it's being done in lots of different disparate ways, but trying to come together more collaboratively feels really exciting and hopeful. That being said, there really is a pretty profound need for more systemic and structural change. I think it's really important for all of us to name the different barriers that both individuals and communities face. We're living in a very transphobic moment, for example, in the province, to speak about racism that is, an everyday part of a lot of people's realities, and that is through and through on our campus. The ongoing impacts of colonialism, I think naming these things, the violence against women and gender diverse folks, and that there is real need for meaningful change to take place. So I think this involves collective work, as well as obviously all of us contributing to it, but it involves collective work that needs to be led by our kind of leaders on campus. So reviewing all policies, right, in terms of for students and staff, really speaking to and again naming the different barriers that people feel that they experience. Mandatory training, right, that's something that's been talked about for a while, but actually implementing it and recognizing how fundamental it is. I think a lot of people engage in practices and behaviors out of ignorance and not understanding the way that will have impact, and not understanding, what I was speaking to you a bit before, the history and the different contexts that inform certain practices. So language, for example, or everyday kind of ways that we all take for granted that we do things. And the enormous pressure that a lot of people feel to kind of fit into what is perceived as the norm, which is actually not how most people live and move through the world. Obviously a huge one is examining our hiring and our enrollment, again, from that very specific EDI lens. And that work is starting to happen, but I think doing it, again, more kind of full, a more kind of fulsome and integrated approach, and having conversations about, again, how individual departments can address that, how different programs can think about that in their curriculum. Why would students, certain students want to come? Why would certain people want to come and work here? What are the ways that we are making change? And again, not superficial change, but actual systemic, meaningful change. There is a lot of fear around, people talk about it as being woke. People are actually talking about doing away with, particularly down south, language around diversity, equity, inclusion. We speak about it as equity, diversity, inclusion. And I think it is tied to a lot of violence that's happening around immigration, around reproductive rights, and around trans rights in particular, but also more broadly for the 2S LGBTQ population. And I think a lot of that violence and hatred is coming out of a place of fear and also misinformation. And so I think what's really important and what feels hopeful is finding ways to come together. Finding ways to come together to learn about what people are doing, to learn about people more broadly, and to find ways to talk to each other, because we have increasingly come into spaces where we are very polarized and divided. And so I feel really excited about that work. I feel hopeful about that work, and also really grateful because the colleagues that I get to work with do that work every day and do it in really meaningful ways. So I think that's what I would say.